My wife sold all my belongings while I was deployed, thinking I'd never return. So I invited her new boyfriend over for dinner. I came back from war and knocked on the door of my home, but my wife wasn't the one to open it. Instead, it was a skinny white guy I'd never seen before standing there in a robe with a huge smile plastered on his face. "You must be the plumber." "Thank goodness. Our pipes have been clogged up for almost a week." That's when I knew. He had no idea who I was. "Yeah, the pipes," I said, and he stepped aside, waving me into my own house like he owned the place. Which, as I was about to find out, he basically did. The first thing that hit me was how different everything looked. My leather couch, gone. But what made my blood freeze was seeing my father's purple heart on the mantel, in a display case I'd never seen before. "Nice metal," I managed to say, walking closer to it. "Oh man, that's my prize piece." He actually picked it up, turning it over in his hands like it was some trinket. "My girlfriend gave it to me when we moved in together. She said it's from when her husband died overseas. Gave me a great deal on a bunch of military stuff." My throat went dry. "Harley sold my dead father's purple heart while I was getting mortared in Afghanistan." "So how long have you guys been together?" I managed to ask through gritted teeth. His whole face lit up. "For about 10 months now. I'd left for deployment 11 months ago." That's when I heard it, the sound of a baby crying from the living room. "Is that your baby?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, our little miracle," he beamed, picking up the infant. "Born 6 weeks ago. Harley says she looks just like her dad." The room started spinning. Things moved fast between us. But it's like they say, when you know, you know. I forced myself to nod, focusing on the metal to keep from losing it completely. "Beautiful family," I managed. He set the baby back in the bouncer, then studied me for a second. "She'll be home in about an hour. You should meet her. She loves talking to veterans." I looked at him, confused. "How'd you know I served?" He pointed at my stature. "The way you're standing. Perfect posture even while looking at pipes." My brother stood like that. He died in Iraq 5 years back. The way he said it, with that hollow sound of grief mixed with respect, I knew he was a good guy. He had no idea he was standing in my house, holding my father's medal, sleeping with my wife, raising a baby that should have been mine. "I'm sorry about your brother," I said, and I meant it. "Hey, you know what? Why don't you come back for dinner tonight? I'm making steaks, and Harley would love to meet another vet. She says it helps her feel connected to him." "Actually," I said, "let me cook for you guys. As a thank you. I insist." He looked surprised but pleased. "Really? That's so generous, man. I'll make sure to show you around the kitchen and help with whatever you need." The irony was palpable. 7 o'clock? I suggested. "I'll bring everything." "Deal! Harley's gonna love this surprise." After actually fixing the pipes, I left through my own front door and sat in my truck for 20 minutes, hands shaking. Then I drove to base, put on my dress uniform, the one with all my deployment ribbons, my combat action badge, everything. If Harley wanted to play widow, I'd give her exactly what she asked for. When I knocked on the door at 7, balancing the grocery bags, he answered with that same big smile. The baby was in his arms, dressed in a onesie that said, "Daddy's girl." "Hey, you came, and you even wore the dress uniform. Harley's going to love this. She keeps saying she wishes she could have seen her husband in his one more time." The dining room table was set for 3. My wedding china, the silverware we got as an engagement gift. I walked into my own kitchen like a guest and started unpacking the steaks. He poured wine into glasses I'd bought for our 5th anniversary. "Harley should be here any minute," he said, checking his phone. "She's been at her grief counseling. Goes twice a week still. This is really cool of you, man. Making dinner for strangers." "We're not strangers," I said quietly. "Not anymore." That's when we heard the key in the lock. The door opened, and I heard her voice. That same voice that told me she loved me before every deployment, that promised to wait for me, that swore I was her everything. "Babe, whose truck is that in the—" She walked into the dining room and stopped mid-sentence. The color drained from her face like someone pulled a plug. The grocery bag in her hands hit the floor. Eggs cracked. Milk started pooling. "You're supposed to be dead," she whispered. Her boyfriend looked between us, confusion spreading across his face. "Harley? Who is this?" I stood up slowly, straightening my uniform. "I'm her husband, the dead one. I think we need to talk." I led them to my living room. I walked into the center of the room and sat down in the brown recliner that used to be where I'd watch football every Sunday. Kenji stood near the couch holding the baby against his chest, one hand supporting her head like he'd done it 1,000 times. Harley stayed frozen by the doorway, one hand gripping the frame like she might fall over without it. The silence pressed down on all of us, thick and heavy, until I couldn't take it anymore. I looked straight at Harley and asked the question that had been burning in my gut since I walked through that door. How long was she planning to keep this going? Her mouth opened and closed a few times before any sound came out. When she finally spoke, her voice shook so bad I almost didn't recognize it. She said she really thought I wasn't coming back, that the casualty reports from my unit scared her so much she convinced herself I was gone. I watched her hands twist the wedding ring on her finger, the same ring I'd saved up 3 months of pay to buy. My jaw got so tight it hurt. Even now, standing there caught in her lie, she was trying to make this about her fear instead of what she chose to do. She kept talking about how scared she was, how alone, how the grief was eating her alive. I just stared at her, waiting for her to get to the part where she actually took responsibility for selling my stuff and moving another man into our house. That part never came. Kenji shifted the baby to his other arm and spoke up for the first time since we sat down. His voice was quiet, but firm when he asked Harley why she never mentioned being married. Why every photo in the house showed only her. Why she told him her husband died when I was just deployed. Harley's face went red and she looked down at the floor. She admitted she boxed up everything with my face in it and put it all in the garage. Then she looked at me with something that might have been shame and said she needed a fresh start while I was gone. A fresh start. Like I was an old jacket she didn't want anymore. I stood up fast enough that the recliner rocked back. I walked straight to the mantel and picked up my father's purple heart from the display case Kenji bought. I didn't ask permission. I just took it. The metal felt cold and heavy in my hand, heavier than it should for something so small. Kenji watched me, but he didn't say anything, didn't try to stop me. His eyes showed he understood what that metal meant, and that small bit of respect from him kept me from putting my fist through the wall. I held the metal tight and turned back to face both of them. I told them straight out that I wasn't here to blow up anyone's life, but I also wasn't going to pretend I was dead so Harley could keep playing house. Kenji nodded slowly, his face serious. Harley started crying, tears running down her cheeks as she asked what I expected her to do now. The question made something twist in my chest because, even crying, even caught, she still hadn't said she was sorry. Not once. Not for selling my father's metal, not for lying about me being dead, not for any of it. Kenji looked down at the baby in his arms, then gently passed her to Harley. He asked if we could talk man to man for a minute. I nodded and followed him through the kitchen to the back porch. My back porch. The one I built the deck railing for 2 summers ago. We stood there in the cold November air, and Kenji told me straight up that he had no idea. He said everything Harley told him about being a widow matched up with how she acted. The grief counseling, the way she talked about her dead husband, all of it seemed real. Now he was trying to process that the woman he loved was someone completely different from who he thought she was. I believed him. The pain in his face was too raw to be fake. I found myself explaining that I wasn't angry at him, just at the whole situation. He asked what I wanted to happen next, and I realized I didn't actually have an answer. I just knew I couldn't let her keep erasing me like I never existed. We stood there quiet for a minute, both of us looking out at the backyard I used to mow every weekend. Then we went back inside. Harley was sitting on the couch now, rocking the baby and staring at nothing. I stayed standing and laid out some basic ground rules. No more selling my stuff, no more telling people I was dead. We needed to figure out the legal side of this mess. Harley agreed fast, too fast, nodding at everything I said. It felt like she was hoping that if she just went along with whatever I wanted, I'd disappear again, and she could go back to her new life. I told her I was going to stay on base tonight, and we'd deal with the details tomorrow, but I needed a list of everything she sold and where it went. Her face got tight, and she started to argue that she didn't remember it all. Before she could finish, Kenji spoke up. He said he had receipts for the things he bought, and he'd send them to me. I looked at him and nodded, grateful that at least one person in this room was being straight with me. Before I left, I needed to know one more thing. I asked about the baby's timeline. When she was conceived. When Harley found out she was pregnant. The math in my head made it pretty clear the baby was Kenji's, but I needed to hear it. Harley's face went white as paper. She said she wasn't completely sure because we had a brief visit home right before my deployment started. The room went dead silent. I felt something cold spread through my chest, but I kept my face blank. Kenji's whole body went stiff, and he stared at Harley like he'd never seen her before. His hands started shaking, and he set the baby down in her bouncer real careful, like he was afraid he might drop her. He turned back to Harley, and his voice came out flat and cold when he asked if she was really saying the baby might not be his. Harley's crying got worse, and she kept saying she thought the baby was his. She was pretty sure, but she couldn't swear to it because of that last visit I made home. I watched Kenji's face go through about 5 different emotions in 10 seconds, landing on something that looked like pain mixed with anger. He asked when exactly that visit was, and Harley admitted it was right around the time she got pregnant, maybe a week or 2 before. The room felt like all the air got sucked out of it. I made myself speak up and told them both we needed a paternity test before anyone made decisions about custody or money or anything else. Kenji nodded right away, still staring at Harley like he was trying to figure out who she really was. Harley started protesting, saying it didn't matter because she knew in her heart whose baby it was. I cut her off and said hearts don't hold up in court, facts do, and we were going to deal in facts from now on. She opened her mouth to argue, but I was already standing up, done with this conversation for tonight. I walked over to the mantel and picked up my father's purple heart again, this time putting it in my uniform pocket where it belonged. Kenji watched me do it and didn't say a word, just gave me this small nod like he understood. I pulled out my phone and told Kenji to give me his number so we could coordinate the paternity test and figure out the property stuff. He rattled off his number and I saved it under his name, which felt weird because an hour ago I didn't even know this guy existed. Harley was still crying on the couch, asking what was going to happen now, but I couldn't deal with her questions. I told them both I'd be in touch in a day or two once I figured some things out, then I headed for the front door. Walking through my own house to leave felt wrong on every level, but I couldn't stay there another minute. I stepped outside into the cold November air and pulled the door shut behind me. Second time today I'd left through that door, but this time I had my father's medal in my pocket and a stranger's phone number in my contacts. I sat in my truck for a few minutes before starting it, just staring at the house I used to call home. The porch light was on, same light I'd installed 3 years ago. The mailbox still had our last name on it, but none of it was mine anymore. I kept replaying Harley saying she needed a fresh start, like I was just an old couch she didn't want anymore, something to sell off and replace. I started the truck and drove back toward base, taking the long way because I wasn't ready to be around people yet. The streets were pretty empty this late and I just drove on autopilot, my brain trying to process everything that happened. When I finally got to base, I went straight to the temporary quarters building and checked in with the guy at the desk. He gave me a key to a small room on the second floor and told me the bathroom was down the hall. I climbed the stairs feeling like I'd aged about 20 years in one day. The room was basic, just a narrow bed, a desk, and a chair. I sat on the edge of the bed, still in my dress uniform, and stared at the blank white wall across from me. My wife of 7 years had sold my dead father's military honor to her boyfriend like it was a garage sale trinket. She'd moved another man into our house, had his baby, and told everyone I was dead. I lay back on the bed without even taking off my uniform and just stared at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Kenji's face when he realized the baby might not be his, or Harley's face when she saw me standing in the dining room. Around 3 in the morning, I finally fell asleep and dreamed about knocking on doors that wouldn't open, walking through my house while everything disappeared around me. When I woke up the next morning, my uniform was wrinkled and my body ached like I'd been in a fight. I sat up and looked around the tiny room, remembering where I was and why. The anger from yesterday had settled into something colder and more focused. I grabbed my phone and started making a list of every single item I could remember owning. The leather couch my parents gave us as a wedding gift. My camping gear from all those trips before I deployed. The toolbox with my dad's initials scratched in the bottom. My collection of military books. The coffee maker I'd bought with my first paycheck. I typed it all into my phone, every single thing I could picture. Then I logged into our joint bank account, the one Harley was supposed to use for bills while I was gone. I took screenshots of every deposit she'd made from selling my stuff. $300 here, $500 there, sometimes smaller amounts like $50 or $75. It added up to thousands of dollars, all from selling things that were mine. I wrote down the timeline too, starting from when I left for deployment 11 months ago. Then when she started seeing Kenji 10 months ago, just 1 month after I left, when she got pregnant around 8 months ago, when the baby was born 6 weeks ago. My training in the military taught me that emotion without evidence is just noise, so I was building a case even though I didn't know yet exactly what I was building it for. By the time I finished documenting everything, it was almost 10 in the morning. I pulled up the number for the base legal office and called them. A paralegal answered and asked how she could help. I told her I needed to talk to a JAG officer about a divorce. Hearing that word out loud made something in my chest twist up tight, but I pushed through it and said yes, it was about a divorce. She scheduled me for 2 o'clock that afternoon and told me to bring any documentation I had. I thanked her and hung up, then sat there holding my phone and trying to accept that my marriage was really over. Meanwhile, across town, Kenji was sitting in the house with his daughter in his arms. Harley had finally gone into the garage and pulled out the boxes of my stuff she'd hidden, the ones with all our wedding photos and pictures from better times. Kenji spread them out on the coffee table, my coffee table, and looked at photo after photo of Harley and me. Our wedding day with both of us smiling huge, at the beach during our honeymoon. Me in my uniform at various promotions and ceremonies. Harley kissing my cheek at some party. Every photo showed a couple that looked happy and solid, nothing like what he'd walked into last night. He set the baby in her bouncer and pulled out his journal, the leather one he'd been keeping since his brother died in Iraq 5 years back. He opened to a blank page and started writing about how grief had made him weak, how he'd been so desperate to honor his brother's memory that he'd fallen for someone who used that grief as a weapon. He wrote about meeting Harley at the grief support group, how her story about losing her husband overseas had felt like fate, like maybe he could help this widow the way he wished someone had helped his family. Now he was looking at wedding photos of the husband who wasn't actually dead, holding a baby who might not even be his, living in a house that never belonged to him. After he finished writing, Kenji made coffee and waited for Harley to wake up. She'd cried herself to sleep on the couch around midnight, and he'd thrown a blanket over her before going to sleep in the guest room. When she finally came into the kitchen around 11, her eyes were red and puffy. He poured her a cup of coffee and they sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd eaten breakfast yesterday morning thinking everything was fine. He asked her straight up to explain how she could build an entire relationship on a lie about being widowed. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that Harley had never heard before. She wrapped her hands around the coffee mug and started talking about how lonely and scared she was during the deployment, how every news report about casualties made her sure I wasn't coming back. She said when she met him at the grief group, the lie just kind of grew on its own, fed by her fear that I really would die over there. Kenji listened without interrupting, his face blank. When she finished, he asked the question that had been eating at him all night. Did she ever really love him? Or was he just convenient, just someone to fill the empty space in her life? Harley swore she did love him, that her feelings were real, even if the way they started was messed up. She reached for his hand across the table, but he pulled back. He shook his head and told her he needed space to think, that he couldn't trust anything she said right now when their whole foundation was built on lies. How could he believe her feelings were real when everything else had been fake? Harley started begging him not to leave, reminding him about the baby, about the life they'd built together. But Kenji cut her off and said he'd be there for his daughter no matter what the paternity test said, because he wasn't the kind of man who walked away from a child. But he needed to figure out if he could stay with a woman who'd lied about something this big, this important. He stood up from the table and told her he was going to start looking for his own place, somewhere he could think clearly without being surrounded by reminders of all the lies. After Harley went back to sleep on the couch, Kenji walked through the house with new eyes, starting in the garage where he kept his tools. He opened the red toolbox he'd bought at the hardware store 6 months ago and ran his fingers over the handle, remembering how proud he'd been to finally have a complete set. But now he wondered whose toolbox had been there before. What happened to the previous owner's tools? He moved to the backyard where the grill stood, the one he'd assembled himself on a sunny Saturday, while Harley watched from the porch with lemonade. The instruction manual was still in the storage compartment underneath, his handwriting on the warranty card. Everything masculine in this house either came from him or was, so generic it could belong to anyone. He went back inside and checked the hall closet where he stored his camping gear, the tent and sleeping bags and portable stove he'd purchased, thinking we'd take family trips once the baby got older. In the bedroom, his clothes hung in the closet next to Harley's dresses, his shoes lined up on his side of the floor. But there were no photos of another man, no evidence that someone else had ever lived here, no leftover belongings that didn't fit. It hit him then, really hit him, that Harley had erased me completely, sold off everything I owned like I was already gone, like my existence was just inventory to liquidate. He pulled out his phone and started typing a message to me, his thumbs moving fast across the screen. The text came through while I was sitting in my truck outside the base housing office, staring at paperwork for temporary quarters. Kenji's message was long, several paragraphs apologizing for living in my house, sleeping in my bed, benefiting from my loss even though he didn't know. He said he felt sick knowing he'd been displaying my father's Purple Heart like a trophy, wearing my dead father's honor on his mantle while I was getting shot at overseas. Then he said he wanted to help me get everything back, that he'd kept every receipt from when Harley sold him stuff, or when they bought things together. He started sending photos, screenshots of PayPal transactions, and text message conversations with pawn shop owners and people on Facebook Marketplace. I scrolled through them, seeing my leather couch sold for $300, my camping gear for $150, my books and DVDs for $20 each. There were receipts from an estate sale where Harley had apparently sold my military uniforms, my deployment photos, my challenge coins from various units. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone. I texted back telling him I didn't hold him responsible, that we were both victims of her choices in different ways. I thanked him for the receipts and said they'd help me document everything for the lawyers. Then I asked if he was willing to do the paternity test, because we needed to know the truth before anyone made legal decisions about custody or support. His response came back in less than a minute saying he'd already looked up clinics in the area, found one that did same-day appointments, and we could go whenever I was ready. I told him I'd call them tomorrow to set it up. That afternoon, I had my appointment with the JAG office, meeting with a captain named Weston Bright in a small office that smelled like coffee and old paper. He was maybe 40, with graying hair and the kind of calm expression that made you think he'd heard every awful story there was to hear. I sat across from his desk and told him everything, starting with coming home and finding Kenji at my door, going through the dinner confrontation, discovering the baby, learning about the sales. Weston listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, his face not showing much reaction. When I finished, he set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. He told me straight that most of what happened was civil law, not military jurisdiction, but he could guide me on protecting my rights and help me understand the divorce process. I asked what I could do about Harley selling my stuff, whether that was illegal, or if I was just screwed because we were married. Weston explained that selling my property without consent was called conversion, which was illegal. But getting criminal charges filed would be tricky since we were married, and it was technically community property in the house. He said my best bet was documenting everything for civil court and possibly filing a police report to create an official record, even if it didn't lead to criminal charges. The documentation would help prove malicious intent and support a civil claim for restitution. I asked about the house itself, whether I had the right to move back in, or if I needed her permission since she'd been living there with Kenji. Weston told me that legally it was my home too, My name was on the deed and the mortgage, but forcing my way back in could complicate things and make me look aggressive in divorce proceedings. He said it was smarter to stay in base housing and handle everything through proper legal channels, let the courts decide how to divide property, rather than creating a confrontation that could hurt my case. He recommended I contact a civilian mediator to start separation negotiations before filing for divorce, someone who could help us divide property without a nasty court battle. I agreed because honestly, I didn't want to drag this out for months or years. I just wanted my stuff back and my life back, whatever that looked like now. Weston also suggested I file a report with the local police about the property conversion, not to get Harley arrested necessarily, but to have official documentation that could support a civil claim later. He gave me the name of a detective, Peng Norris, who handled property crimes and had experience with military cases. I scheduled an appointment for the next day. Before I left the JAG office, Weston asked me how I was doing emotionally, if I had support systems in place. I gave him the standard answer every soldier gives, that I was fine, I'd dealt with worse overseas, I could handle this. He didn't buy it. I could tell by the way his expression shifted. He handed me a card for base mental health services and said that betrayal trauma was real trauma, that coming home to find your wife had declared you dead and sold your life wasn't something you just toughed out alone. I took the card and shoved it in my pocket, thanking him for his time. That evening, Harley drove to her regular therapy appointment with Gianna Guerra, a counselor she'd been seeing since a few months into my deployment. She sat in the familiar waiting room with its soft lighting and nature paintings, bouncing the baby on her knee, dreading having to explain what happened. When Gianna called her back, Harley settled into the usual chair and tried to smile, but her face crumpled immediately. Gianna asked how the week had been, her standard opening question, and Harley broke down completely, tears running down her face as she admitted that her husband came back from the dead and everything was falling apart. Gianna sat back in her chair, and her face went completely still, the kind of calm that comes right before someone says something you don't want to hear. She asked Harley to clarify something, speaking slowly like she wanted to make absolutely sure she understood correctly. Did Harley tell people her husband died when he was actually deployed and alive? Harley nodded and the tears came harder, words spilling out about how she was so sure he wouldn't make it back, how the casualty reports from his unit terrified her, how she convinced herself he was already gone. Gianna held up one hand to stop her and said that fear doesn't justify lying to a grief counseling group about being widowed, that the group was for people dealing with actual loss, and Harley had taken space from someone who genuinely needed it. Harley tried to defend herself, saying she felt like a widow because of how alone she was during the deployment, how every day felt like mourning someone who might never come home. Gianna leaned forward and her voice got firmer, not angry, but not soft either. She pointed out that Harley didn't just lie to strangers in a support group. She built an entire relationship with Kenji based on false widowhood, sold her husband's belongings, including military honors, and let another man move into the marital home while her actual husband was in a war zone. Harley's face crumpled, and she tried to explain that she didn't plan any of it, that meeting Kenji at the grief group just happened, and the lie grew from there. But Gianna cut her off again. She asked directly if Harley understood that these actions have legal problems beyond just hurt feelings, that taking someone's property and selling it is called conversion, and lying about major facts in a relationship could be considered fraud. Harley admitted she didn't think that far ahead. She just wanted to stop feeling abandoned and scared all the time, wanted to feel like someone cared about her. Gianna wrote something in her notes and then told Harley that her next steps needed to include full honesty, telling the grief group the truth about her husband being alive, working with him to return his property, and being completely honest with Kenji about everything, including the baby's father being uncertain. Harley's whole body tensed up, and she said she couldn't do that. It would embarrass her in front of everyone, make her look like a terrible person. Gianna responded that embarrassment is a result of her choices, not a reason to keep lying, and that the longer she waited to come clean, the worse it would get. Harley grabbed a tissue and twisted it in her hands, asking what people would think of her, how she could face the grief group again. Gianna said that was Harley's problem to solve, that she created this situation by lying, and now she had to deal with the fallout, and maybe losing some relationships was the price for deceiving people who trusted her. Then Gianna brought up the baby, noting that right now there were two men who might be the father, and the child deserved to know the truth about her family and get proper support from whoever turned out to be her biological dad. She told Harley to agree to paternity testing right away and to start thinking about how to handle custody and parenting in a way that put the baby first, instead of Harley's comfort. Harley asked what she should do about Kenji, whether she should try to fix the relationship and make him understand why she did what she did. Gianna shook her head and said that wasn't the important thing right now, that being responsible and following the law mattered more than saving a relationship built on lies. If the relationship survived after full honesty, it would have to be completely rebuilt, which meant Harley needed to stop trying to control what everyone thought and start dealing with reality. The session ended with Harley agreeing to draft a message to the grief group, though she looked sick about it. The next morning, I met Detective Peng at the police station and walked him through everything starting from when I deployed 11 months ago. I showed him the timeline of when I left versus when Harley started seeing Kenji, the bank statements showing deposits from selling my stuff, and the list of items I knew were missing. Detective Peng took notes carefully in a small notebook, asking questions about specific items and their value, whether I had photos or receipts proving ownership. He explained that because we were married, the property situation got tricky since technically she had legal access to things in the house. But selling items with obvious personal meaning like my father's Purple Heart could be argued as mean-spirited conversion even between spouses. He agreed to open an official report and document everything, which would help in civil court even if criminal charges didn't go anywhere. I pulled out the list Kenji had sent me of everything he bought from Harley, complete with receipts and photos, and the detective actually looked impressed. He said that level of help from the boyfriend was unusual and would make it much easier to track down my belongings and figure out what got sold versus what Harley still had. He made copies of all Kenji's documentation and added it to the file. Then Detective Peng asked if I wanted to press charges for anything else, like fraud or identity theft or anything connected to her telling people I was dead. I sat there thinking about it for a while, imagining Harley getting arrested or going to court, and I realized I didn't want that. I told him I just wanted my property back and my marriage ended without more drama, that putting her in jail wouldn't give me back the year she stole or make any of this better. He nodded like he understood and said he'd keep the report open and active, which meant if I changed my mind later, or if new information came up, we could add to it. Detective Peng closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair, studying me for a moment before speaking. He told me he'd personally visit some of the pawn shops and online buyers to verify the sales and get statements from them about how Harley presented the items. He said he'd include everything in his official report, which would carry weight if this ever went to civil court, or if I decided to press charges later. Then he added something that made me sit up straighter. He said that if Harley cooperated with returning items or paying restitution, that would look much better for her if prosecutors ever got involved, or if a judge had to make decisions about property division. The way he said it made it clear he was giving me leverage, a fact I could use to push Harley toward doing the right thing without needing to threaten her directly. I thanked him and started gathering my papers, ready to leave, when he stood up and walked around his desk. His voice changed, got quieter and more personal. He told me he was a veteran too, served 2 tours in Iraq before he became a cop, and he was sorry this was what I came home to. He said no soldier should have to fight a war overseas and then come home to fight another one in their own house. That small acknowledgement from another person who served, who understood what deployment meant and what coming home should have been, hit me harder than I expected. My throat tightened and I had to look away, focusing on the clock on the wall until I could trust my voice again. I shook his hand, managed to say thank you, and walked out of the station with my documentation folder pressed against my chest like armor. I made it to my truck in the parking lot and sat there for a full 10 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to process the simple kindness of someone saying they were sorry about what happened to me. It shouldn't have mattered that much, but it did. I pulled out my phone and looked at the addresses Kenji had sent me, a list of pawn shops and secondhand stores where Harley had sold my stuff over the past months. The afternoon stretched ahead of me with nothing scheduled, so I decided to start tracking down whatever I could find. The first shop was on the east side of town, tucked between a laundromat and a check-cashing place, with bars on the windows, and a flickering neon sign that said, "Cash for Gold." I walked in, and the smell hit me immediately, that particular mix of dust and old electronics and desperation that all pawn shops seem to share. A guy behind the counter looked up from his phone, middle-aged with a beard and tired eyes, and asked if I needed help. I pulled up the photo Kenji had sent of my toolbox and asked if he still had it. The guy squinted at the screen, then told me to wait a minute while he checked the back. He disappeared through a doorway behind the counter, and I stood there looking at the glass cases full of jewelry and watches and phones, wondering how many other people's lives were sitting in those displays. When he came back, he was carrying my toolbox, the red metal one with scratches and dents from years of use. I reached for it automatically, but he pulled it back, not mean but cautious, and asked how I knew it was mine. I turned it over and pointed to the bottom where my father's initials were scratched into the metal, 3 letters he'd carved there when he first enlisted, before I was even born. The shop owner looked at the initials, then at my face, then back at the toolbox. He asked if I was military, and I told him I just got back from Afghanistan. He nodded slowly and said he'd bought it 3 months ago from a woman who claimed it was her late husband's. He pulled up his records on a computer that looked older than me, confirmed the date and the amount he'd paid, and told me he couldn't just give it back because he'd paid good money for it. I explained the situation, how my wife sold my stuff while I was deployed, how I was working with the police to recover everything. He listened without interrupting, then said he'd hold on to the toolbox for me while I sorted out the legal process for getting it back. He wrote down my contact information and said if I could get a court order or police authorization, he'd release it without making me buy it again. That was more than I'd hoped for, and I thanked him before heading to the next address. The second shop was across town, bigger and cleaner, more like a consignment store than a pawn shop. I found some of my camping gear there, my sleeping bag and tent and portable stove, all tagged and priced higher than what they were worth. I also found a few of my books on a shelf in the back, military history and survival guides I'd collected over the years. The owner was a woman this time, probably in her 50s, and she was sympathetic when I explained what happened. She pulled her transaction records and showed me that Harley had sold the items 4 months ago, right after I'd been deployed for about 7 months. She gave me copies of everything, including photos she'd taken of the items when she was accepted them, and added them to the growing folder of documentation I was building. But she told me the bad news, too. My leather couch and most of the furniture had gone to private buyers through online listings, sold on Facebook Marketplace and Craigslist, and those were much harder to track down. She said people who buy furniture from private sellers rarely keep records, and even if I found them, getting the items back would be nearly impossible without taking each buyer to small claims court. I felt the weight of that reality settle on me, the understanding that some things were just gone forever. I thanked her for the records and left the shop feeling heavier than when I'd walked in. My phone buzzed as I was getting back in my truck. A text from Kenji, long enough that I had to scroll to read it all. He told me he'd scheduled a paternity test appointment for the following week at a clinic downtown, and he'd already informed Harley she needed to bring the baby. He said the clinic would do cheek swabs for all 3 of us, and results would take about 10 days. Then he added something that made me pause. He wrote that he'd been sleeping on the couch since the truth came out, that he couldn't share a bed with Harley anymore knowing she'd lied about everything. He said he'd started looking at apartments because regardless of what the paternity test showed, he couldn't stay in that house. He needed space to think and to figure out what kind of relationship, if any, he could have with Harley going forward. He said the baby deserved stability and he'd be there for her no matter what, but he had to take care of himself too. Reading his words, I felt a strange kinship with this man I barely knew. We were both trying to figure out how to move forward from the wreckage Harley had created. I texted back thanking him for handling the test logistics and asking if he was doing okay. His response came quickly, brutally honest in a way that made me respect him more. He wrote that no, he wasn't okay. He was grieving the relationship he thought he had while trying to be present for a baby who might not even be his biologically. He said he loved that little girl already, had been there since she was born, changed her diapers and walked her at night and sang her to sleep. The idea that she might not be his daughter felt like losing his brother all over again, like everything he loved got taken away. But he also said he couldn't ignore the possibility, couldn't pretend the timeline didn't raise questions. I stared at his message for a long time before responding. I told him I understood that feeling of loss more than I wished I did, that I knew what it was like to have the future you planned ripped away and replaced with something you never asked for. I said he was handling it better than most people would, that taking care of the baby while setting boundaries with Harley showed real strength. His response was just 2 words. Thank you. The next day, I looked up the contact information for Ling Lambert, the civilian mediator Weston had recommended. Her website said she specialized in military divorces and property disputes, which seemed almost too perfect. I called her office and got her directly instead of a receptionist. Her voice was calm and professional, but not cold, and she listened to my whole story without interrupting. When I finished, she said she could take our case and explained her process. She'd start by sending intake forms to both me and Harley, asking us to list all assets, debts, and desired outcomes. Then she'd review everything and propose a mediation structure that would help us divide property and finalize the divorce without going to court if possible. She emphasized that mediation only worked if both parties committed to honesty and good faith negotiation, and if either of us couldn't do that, we'd end up in front of a judge anyway. I told her I was committed to being honest and just wanted this resolved fairly. She said she'd send the forms that afternoon and asked for Harley's email address. I gave it to her and we scheduled a preliminary call for the following week. The intake forms arrived in my email an hour later, a PDF with pages of questions about assets, income, debts, and what I wanted from the divorce. I sat at the desk in my temporary base housing and filled them out carefully, taking my time with each question. Under assets, I listed the house with its approximate value and remaining mortgage balance, both cars, the joint bank accounts, and my personal belongings that Harley had sold. Under debts, I listed the mortgage, my truck loan, and a small credit card balance. Under desired outcomes, I wrote that I wanted the house sold and the equity split according to state law. I wanted my personal belongings returned or compensated for at reasonable replacement value. I wanted a clean divorce with no ongoing contact beyond what was legally necessary. Then I came to the section that asked about desired outcomes beyond property and finances, and I stopped typing. I sat there for several minutes just staring at the blank space, trying to figure out how to put into words what I actually wanted. Finally, I wrote that I just wanted to move forward with my life and recover what I could of my identity, that I wanted to stop feeling like I'd been erased from my own existence. I saved the document and sent it back to Ling, then immediately wondered if I'd written too much or sounded too emotional. 2 days later, Ling called to tell me she'd received Harley's intake forms and wanted to discuss them with me before our first mediation session. She said Harley's responses were defensive and vague, which was typical for someone in her position, but would make mediation more challenging. Harley had claimed that most of the sales were necessary to pay bills, that she thought the items were hers to manage as the person living in the house, and that she wanted to keep the house because it was her daughter's home. Ling read some of Harley's exact words to me, about how she'd been abandoned and scared, and did what she had to do to survive. I listened without commenting, letting Ling finish before I responded. I told her that Harley's version didn't match the bank records, which showed the money from sales going into accounts I couldn't access while deployed, and it didn't explain why she sold items with obvious sentimental value like my father's Purple Heart. Ling agreed and said her job was to help us find middle ground between our positions, but that required both parties to acknowledge reality instead of defending untenable positions. She said Harley's desire to keep the house was unrealistic, given she couldn't afford the mortgage alone, and my desire for complete no contact might need some flexibility depending on how property division played out. Ling proposed a structured mediation process that would happen over 3 sessions. The first session would focus just on immediate living arrangements and property access, figuring out who lived where and who could access what while we worked through everything else. The second session would tackle dividing assets and debts, including the house sale and my personal property. The third session would finalize divorce terms and create a separation agreement we could file with the court. She emphasized again that this only worked if both Harley and I committed to honesty and good faith negotiation, and if we couldn't reach agreement, we'd end up in litigation, which would cost more money and take more time. I told her I was willing to try mediation, and I'd show up in good faith. She said she'd send both of us a formal mediation agreement to sign and would schedule our first session for after the paternity test results came back, since that would affect some of the decisions we needed to make. I agreed and hung up, feeling like I'd just signed up for something that was going to be harder than any mission I'd run overseas. I called Ling back the next day and told her I was ready to start mediation whenever she could schedule it. She said she'd reach out to Harley and get back to me with dates. 2 days later, Ling called again to say that Harley had initially refused, but her therapist convinced her to participate, and we had our first session scheduled for the week after the paternity results came back. I thanked her and hung up, feeling like I'd just committed to running towards something I wanted to avoid. Harley sat in Gianna's office that same week, her hands twisting in her lap while Gianna pulled out a notepad. Gianna told her it was time to start making things right, starting with the grief counseling group. Harley's face went pale and she asked if she really had to tell them. Couldn't she just quietly leave the group instead? Gianna shook her head and said that leaving without explanation was just another form of deception, that real accountability meant facing the people she'd lied to and giving them the truth. Harley started crying, but Gianna handed her the notepad and told her to start drafting a message. For the next 40 minutes, Harley wrote and rewrote, trying to find words that didn't make her sound completely terrible. She kept adding phrases about how scared she was and how alone she felt, but Gianna crossed them out every time. The final message was short and direct, admitting she'd lied about being widowed, that her husband was alive and they were separating, and that she was sorry for deceiving the group. Gianna read it over one more time, made Harley remove the word "but" from 2 sentences, and told her to send it before she left the office. Harley's fingers shook as she hit send on her phone, posting the message to the private group. Within minutes, responses started coming in. Some people wrote supportive messages saying they understood grief made people do strange things, and they hoped she found peace. Others were angry, saying she'd taken support and sympathy that should have gone to real widows, and asking her to leave the group immediately. A few people just unfriended her without comment. Harley watched the notifications pile up, her face getting redder with each one, and finally put her phone face down on the couch. Gianna asked how she felt, and Harley said she felt humiliated and exposed. Gianna nodded and told her that was appropriate, that she'd violated these people's trust, and they had every right to be upset with her. Harley asked if Gianna thought she was a terrible person, and Gianna said no, but she'd done some terrible things, and now she had to live with the results of those choices. Kenji sat in his own therapist's office across town, staring at the wall while his therapist waited patiently for him to start talking. Finally, Kenji said he didn't even know where to begin, that everything he thought was true turned out to be a lie. His therapist asked him to start with what hurt the most. Kenji talked about his brother, about how losing him in Iraq had left this huge hole in his life that never really healed. He said when he met Harley at the grief support group and heard her story about losing her husband overseas, it felt like fate bringing them together, like he could honor his brother by taking care of this widow who understood military loss. His therapist asked if he felt like Harley had used his grief against him. Kenji was quiet for a long time before saying yes, that she'd found his weak spot and built their whole relationship on top of it. But then he talked about the baby, about how much he loved his daughter from the moment she was born, and how scared he was that the paternity test might say she wasn't his. His therapist helped him separate those two things, pointing out that his love for the baby was real, even if the relationship with Harley was built on lies, and that he could be a good father regardless of what happened with Harley. Kenji asked what his brother would do in this situation, and his therapist turned the question back on him. Kenji said his brother never ran from hard things, never abandoned people who needed him, and always tried to do the right thing even when it cost him something. His therapist asked if Kenji saw himself doing those same things now, and Kenji realized that he was staying involved with the baby and setting boundaries with Harley and trying to handle this whole mess with some kind of honor. The day of the paternity test arrived on a cold Tuesday morning. I drove to the clinic and parked next to Kenji's car, which I recognized from all those times I'd seen it in my driveway. We walked into the waiting room at the same time without planning it, and nodded at each other. Harley was already there, sitting in the corner with the baby in a carrier at her feet, filling out forms on a clipboard. The waiting room had plastic chairs and old magazines and a TV playing the news on mute. I sat on the opposite side of the room from Harley, as far away as I could get while still being in the same space. Kenji sat between us, closer to Harley but not right next to her, and picked up the baby when she started fussing. Nobody talked. The only sounds were the baby making little noises, papers rustling, and the receptionist typing. I watched Kenji bounce the baby gently and wondered what he was thinking, whether he was hoping the test would say she was his or dreading it. Harley kept glancing at both of us like she wanted to say something but couldn't figure out what. After about 15 minutes, a technician called us back. We all stood up and followed her down a hallway to a small room with a counter and some supplies. The technician explained the process quickly, saying she'd swab the inside of each of our cheeks and the baby's cheek, that it wouldn't hurt and would only take a few minutes. She started with me, running the swab along the inside of my mouth and sealing it in a tube with my name on it. Then Kenji, then Harley, then the baby, who cried a little but calmed down fast. The technician labeled everything carefully and told us results would take 7 to 10 business days, and we'd get them by email and regular mail. She said the results would show percentage of probability for each potential father, and that anything over 99% was considered conclusive. We thanked her and walked back out to the parking lot together, Harley struggling with the diaper bag while Kenji carried the baby carrier. I ended up next to Kenji at our cars, and we just looked at each other for a second, both exhausted by the weight of waiting and not knowing. I told Kenji that no matter what the results said, I respected how he was handling everything, staying involved with the baby while still setting boundaries with Harley. He looked surprised, like he hadn't expected me to say anything nice to him. He said thanks, and that he'd been thinking a lot about what his brother would do if he were here. I asked what his brother was like, and Kenji's whole face changed, got softer. He said his brother was the kind of guy who never backed down from doing the right thing even when it was hard, who took responsibility seriously and didn't make excuses. He said his brother would have stayed for the baby no matter what, because that's what good men do. They don't run when things get complicated. I nodded and said his brother sounded like someone I would have wanted to serve with. Kenji smiled a little and said he thought his brother would have liked me too. Then he got in his car and drove away, and I sat in my truck for a few minutes before starting the engine. Over the next week, I focused on practical things that I could actually control. I looked at apartments near base and found a small one-bedroom on the second floor of an old building. Nothing fancy, but clean and cheap. I signed the lease and moved in with basically nothing since I didn't have furniture yet, just sleeping on an air mattress and eating off paper plates. I kept going to my therapy sessions with Ronan twice a week. I also started looking at what I might do after the military, whether I wanted to stay in or transition to civilian work, what kind of job I'd even want. Having tasks and lists helped keep my brain from spinning in circles about Harley and the baby and everything I'd lost. Ronan noticed during our next session that I seemed calmer, and I told him it was because I was taking action instead of just reacting to everything Harley had done. He said that was good, that reclaiming control over my own life was an important part of healing from betrayal. Ronan spent a lot of our sessions talking about identity and how mine had gotten tangled up with my marriage and my stuff. He pointed out that Harley had tried to erase me by selling everything that proved I existed, but I was still here, still the same person who served with honor and came home alive. He said the Purple Heart was important because it connected me to my father, but it wasn't what made me my father's son. What made me his son was how I lived, how I handled hard situations, how I treated people even when they hurt me. He asked what I thought my father would say about how I was handling this whole situation, and I had to think about that for a while. Finally, I said my father would probably tell me to stand up for myself, but not to become bitter, to get what was mine back, but not to destroy people in the process. Ronan nodded and said it sounded like I was already doing that. In our next session, I admitted something I hadn't wanted to say out loud. I told Ronan that part of me had wanted to come home to the family I left behind, and finding out about the baby had hit me harder than I expected because it showed me the whole life Harley built while I was gone. Even though I knew the baby probably wasn't mine, there was this stupid part of me that had imagined coming home to a kid, being a father, having that normal family life that a lot of guys talked about during deployment. Ronan leaned forward and said that grief was real and valid, that I was mourning not just my marriage but the future I'd imagined having. But he also said I couldn't parent a child who wasn't mine just because I was sad about what could have been, that the baby deserved a father who was there for her, not for the idea of her. I knew he was right, but it still hurt to accept that the paternity test would probably close that door completely. The paternity results came on a Tuesday morning. I was sitting in my new apartment, drinking coffee from a paper cup because I still didn't have real dishes, when the email notification popped up on my phone. My hands shook a little as I opened it. The results were clear and simple. Kenji was the biological father with 99% certainty. I sat there for a long minute, staring at the numbers on the screen. Part of me felt relieved because it meant no custody battle, no complicated legal fights over a baby. But another part of me felt this deep sadness, like the last possible thread connecting me to Harley had just snapped completely. The baby wasn't mine. The marriage was over. Everything from my old life was gone except the stuff I could recover from pawn shops. I set the phone down and looked around my empty apartment, trying to figure out what I was supposed to feel. I grabbed my phone again and texted Kenji to ask if he got the results too. He responded within a minute saying yes, he got them. He said he was relieved to finally have clarity after weeks of not knowing. He told me he was committed to being a full father to his daughter no matter what. Then he added that he was officially moving out of the house this weekend. He'd found a 2-bedroom apartment across town so the baby could have her own room when she stayed with him. I texted back that I was glad he was stepping up for her, that she deserved a father who was all in. He sent back a thumbs up and said he'd be in touch about the mediation stuff. After that, I just sat there for a while, thinking about how weird it was that Kenji and I were on the same team now, both trying to untangle ourselves from Harley's mess. I picked up my phone one more time and called Harley. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice quiet and careful. I told her I got the paternity results and I knew she did too. There was silence on her end for a few seconds. I said now that paternity was settled, I was ready to move forward with mediation and get everything finalized. More silence. Then she said something that surprised me. She said she was sorry for everything. She said she knew she ruined our marriage and hurt both me and Kenji. Her voice cracked a little when she said it. It was the first real apology I'd heard from her since this whole thing started. Not an excuse or a justification, just an actual apology. I didn't know what to say for a second. It didn't fix anything. It didn't undo the Purple Heart being sold or the lies or the betrayal. But it was something. I told her I appreciated her saying that and we'd talk more at mediation. Then I hung up before the conversation could go anywhere else. 3 days later, our first mediation session happened. Ling Lambert had sent us both emails with the address of her office downtown, a plain building with gray carpet and conference rooms that smelled like coffee and recycling bins. I got there early and sat in the waiting area, watching other people come and go from their own mediations and legal meetings. Harley showed up right on time, looking tired and nervous. We didn't talk to each other in the waiting room. Ling came out and brought us both into a conference room with a long table and chairs on both sides. She sat at the head of the table with me on one side and Harley on the other. Ling started by laying out ground rules in a calm, no-nonsense voice. No interrupting each other, no personal attacks or bringing up old fights. Focus on practical solutions, not emotions. She said we were here to divide property and plan the separation, not to relitigate the past. Both Harley and I nodded. Ling opened a folder with our intake forms and said we'd start with living arrangements since that affected everything else. I explained that I'd already moved into my own apartment near base, and I wasn't interested in moving back into the house. I said the house felt like it belonged to someone else's life now, not mine. Harley's face tightened, but she didn't interrupt. She admitted quietly that she couldn't afford the mortgage on her own now that Kenji was moving out. Kenji had been helping with bills, and now that was ending. Ling asked some questions about the mortgage amount and our incomes, taking notes on a legal pad. Then she suggested we list the house for sale and split the money according to state community property laws, which meant 50-50 since we were married when we bought it. Harley pushed back immediately. She said the house was her daughter's home, the only stable place the baby knew. Ling stayed calm and pointed out that Harley would get her share of the equity from the sale, which could fund a new place that she could actually afford on her own. Harley and Ling went back and forth for a few minutes about timing and whether Harley could refinance to buy me out. Ling pulled up some numbers on her laptop and showed that refinancing wasn't realistic with Harley's income. Eventually, Harley's shoulders sagged and she agreed to list the house. Ling drafted a quick preliminary agreement right there saying we'd list within 30 days and split proceeds equally. We both signed it. Then Ling moved to the next item, which was my personal property. I pulled out the full list I'd been building for weeks. Every item I could remember, from my father's Purple Heart to my camping gear to my books and tools. I also had the documentation from the pawn shops where I'd tracked stuff down, Detective Norris's official report about the property conversion, and the photos Kenji had sent me of receipts. I slid copies across the table to both Ling and Harley. Ling asked Harley to account for the money from selling my stuff. Harley pulled out bank statements, her hands shaking a little as she sorted through them. She showed that most of the money went to mortgage payments, utility bills, groceries, and baby supplies. Ling reviewed the statements carefully, comparing dates of deposits to dates of bills. Then we started negotiating what Harley owed me. Ling suggested a restitution plan. Harley would return any items still in her possession, like some books and tools she hadn't sold yet. She'd pay the redemption fees to get back items from pawn shops that were still available. For items that couldn't be recovered, like my leather couch or things sold to private buyers, she'd pay me based on reasonable replacement value. Ling looked up comparable prices online for some of the bigger items while we sat there. We agreed Harley would make payments over 12 months, with the money coming from her share of the house sale. Ling typed everything into her laptop and printed out a temporary agreement covering all these points. Both Harley and I read through it, and then we signed. The whole session had taken almost 3 hours. As we were packing up our papers and getting ready to leave, Harley asked quietly if we could talk privately for just a minute. I looked at Ling, who nodded and stepped out of the room. Harley and I stood there on opposite sides of the conference table. She looked at me with red eyes and said she knew she destroyed our marriage and any trust between us. She said she hoped someday I could forgive her. I thought about that for a second. Then I told her honestly that I didn't know if I'd ever forgive her for selling my father's metal or lying about me being dead. But I also told her I was choosing not to be consumed by anger about it. I was choosing to move forward with my life instead of staying stuck in what she did. That was the best I could offer right now. She nodded slowly, wiping at her eyes. Then we both walked out of the conference room and went to our separate cars without saying anything else.